What's going on, everybody? Jhow here, and in this Diablo 3 monk build, we're going to talk about the Inna's Wave of Light set, probably one of the easiest builds you could possibly run. It's very easy to run, low risk, high reward, although there are some tips to really take this to the next level, but this is dominating Season 16, so we're going to talk about the skills, the gear, the non-season versus seasonal build, because it's only one item that you have to worry about because it's powerful in both, but we're going to talk about all of that here in just a moment. Let's get into it. All right, so I'll preface this by saying that if you're running this on non-seasonal, all you have to do is make sure you have the Obsidian Ring worn and the Ring of Royal Grandeur in your cube. We'll get back to the gear later, but first, this build does work on seasonal and non, but we'll talk about the seasonal implications. But for the skills, you're going to be running with Mystic Ally. You want to pick the Fire Ally because you'll get the fire damage, the elemental damage for this, so that it does do fire damage, and then you can play into that because your next skill is the Wave of Light with Explosive Light, meaning this is a fire build, meaning the elemental damage that you have on your gear will apply, and that's why it's important with your Mystic Ally. Wave of Light, Explosive Light, this is your primary source of damage. Don't make any mistake about it. This is where all of your damage, or a vast majority of your damage, will be coming from. The allies do get in there, they do get dirty. Next up, Dashing Strike with Blinding Speed. This will give you 40% increased chance to dodge for 4 seconds after using Dashing Strike. Now, there is going to be some cooldown management stuff we'll talk about later in this video, but you are going to have a very high dodge chance with this build, and making sure to prioritize your Dashing Strike at the right moment. We'll talk about some of the tips and tricks about that, but this is going to help with that dodge chance. Since most of it is just all about getting the Wave of Lights out, Serenity will be there. This is a 16-second cooldown, however, you're going to make sure and go with Ascension. That way you get to absorb all incoming damage for 4 seconds, and you get that immune. You're basically self-cleansed there. That's going to help a lot to your survivability. Speaking of survivability, Epiphany with Desert Shroud. This will reduce damage taken by 50%. This allows you to be extra tanky. This has been popular in monk builds for quite some time. Just very strong. And as mentioned, another defensive ability here, you're going to get extra resistances with the Mantra of Salvation and the agility to make sure you get extra resistances, the passives, everything that will be there, and the dodge chance. So you're going to be very tanky with a lot of your skills because most of your damage, Wave of Light, and then the mobility, and that's all that you're really worrying about. And with this build, Wave of Light is going to be cast at range, which makes this build even easier to run. For passives, Beacon of Vitar. Reducing the cooldown is good. You're going to be playing around cooldowns a lot. You need some cooldown reduction, but it's nothing you have to heavily spec into. When we get to the gear part, we'll talk about how you'll get some of that cooldown reduction back and how effective some cooldown reduction can be, but it doesn't need to be an overcommitment, but you want to have some. Next up, the Guardian's Path. I already mentioned all of the dodge chance that you're going to have. You're going to be dual wielding, so you're going to get that 35% dodge as well with this one. Near-death experience, just always good for pushing high greater rifts. This allows you to have that secondary life. It's good to be tanky, but you can only be so tanky for so long. So near-death experience, great for climbing the greater rift leaderboard. Next up, Seize the Initiative. Dealing damage to enemies above 75% life will increase attack speed. You're going to be going through, this is very good against white mobs. Single target damage, not so much. So grouping things up is going to be paramount with this. But bursting through those high damage dealers, getting that extra attack speed is going to help out a lot because you want to get those Wave of Lights out quickly, and this is one good way to do it. Now for this build, it's very reminiscent of the no-set build video that we did previously leading up to Season 16. Now that Season 16 has unfolded, it's very clear that Inna's is the way to go and using that Ring of Royal Grandeur. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you don't have the ring, or if you're not on seasonal, then you need to use that Ring of Royal Grandeur, whether it's equipped or in your cube, but you have to make sure that the Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac is in one of those slots. And that's very important, but we'll get to that in a moment. First, let's talk about the build in general with the gear. The Kiyoshiro's Blade. Increase the damage of Wave of Light, and when the initial Wave of Light hits 3 or fewer enemies, that damage is increased. This is good. That second part is very good for the Rift bosses, but the overall damage increase is super powerful for what you need to do. You socket this with the crit hit gem. You might want to go for some cooldown reduction here, but some of the specs that you can go with on this, you want to make sure you have some cooldown reduction in areas on your gear, maybe get that bonus damage as well as some area damage if you can get this augmented later on. Next up, Ravage Strike. Spirit Spinders that teleport you while Epiphany is active are also mimicked on a nearby target for free. This isn't quite as powerful as we would have seen before, but this gives you different ways to get damage in there. You can get the crit hit damage on here as well, which really makes this powerful, and the Ravage Strike really fits in well, so you're not necessarily getting as much value out as the secondary, so much as you are that bonus crit damage. This is very good for this dual-wielding build. Now, speaking of Innas, the reason why we're seeing Innas back in the meta, the two-piece, we know this, increase the passive effect of your Mystic Ally and the base passive effect of your Mantra by 100%. Since you're running those mantras and those allies, this is very strong to be extra tanky. And we mentioned you're already getting those resistances. This is going to help even further. Next up, gain the base effect of all 4 mantras at all times. We know that you get that. That's not as huge a deal as the next one, because we saw the buff here. Gain the 5 ruined Mystic Allies at all times, and your damage has increased by 750% for each Mystic Ally you have out. This is an insane buff and bringing Innas right back into the top of the meta, where we've seen Innas in the past be strong. This will look familiar if you've been around a long time, but this is super buffed and a lot of fun to play right now. Now, we'll go ahead and touch on it because in your cube, you're going to have the crudest boots. And so that's where you're going to have even more allies out. It gives you those bonus allies. And basically, this is an Inna's army that you're going to be running. So this is why this build has been so effective, getting that 750% extra damage for each ally you have out. And given the abundance of allies you have, this is an incredible build. Don't forget on your gear, on your boots, you want to get Wave of Light damage. That's going to help out a lot in your gear. Also, if you're really pushing those high greater rifts on your chest piece, you might want to consider getting that Dex Vitality and reducing elite damage. That's something that we've seen a lot of players gear towards in the high greater rifts. If not, you can go with more traditional rolls there. Some things to keep an eye on. On your gloves, maybe you want to consider the crit hit chance, crit hit damage. If they're augmented, then you can start to look at things like cooldown reduction, area damage, and things like that to really try and push this build to the next level. Else, the attack speed, crit hit damage, crit chance, the crits you always want to prioritize, but dex are all going to be fine to get this bad boy rolling. For your shoulders, this is the most exciting piece, because it actually doesn't matter, okay? It doesn't matter what you have here, just something that has a strong roll, something where you can get that dexterity and cooldown reduction. This is another place where you want to get cooldown reduction. You'd like to roll that 8%. So you have some cooldown reduction potentially on your shoulders, your gloves, maybe a weapon or both, and then maybe a ring. You don't need to really push for it, but you need to have at least 30 to 40% to make this feel impactful, and that is something that there are some numbers out there that you can really play around, but once you start pushing up near that 40-50%, you're going to start seeing much more impactful play because of cooldown reductions and cooldown management, which we'll talk about in a moment. But again, area damage starting to spring up. It's all about having good rolls, but the shoulders, it doesn't matter what you go with. For the helm, you know it, you've seen it in every Wave of Light build. The Zokrin's Gaze Wave of Light is now cast at your enemy, making this a ranged build. You're going to get the Wave of Light damage on your primary stats, but here it's all about getting that range, making you able to use different gear and different legendary gems as well. When we look at the bracers, the Pinto's Pride, we know these, we use them all the time. Wave of Light also slows enemies by 80% and deals increased damage, and this is the extra part, the extra damage. Getting the slow, you're going to be able to proc one of your legendary gems. You want to make sure this has fire skill damage on it for that elemental, the crit hit chance, the dexterity, and then if you get the vitality beyond that. For your amulet, you're going to be going the Traveler's Pledge here for the Endless Walk set. This is going to take care of one of your ring slots, so while moving, damage taken reduced by up to 50%, while standing still, damage dealt is increased by up to 100%. This actually works out well because there are moments where at high greater rifts, you're going to be standing still and just spamming that Wave of Light as much as possible. So this actually synergizes really well. As mentioned previously, you might want to look to get cooldown reduction on your ring. For your amulet, if you can ideally get it, you always want to socket crit chance, crit damage, and then if you can, get fire damage on there, else dexterity will work out very well. When it comes to your other ring slot, I touched on this earlier. If you're on non-season, you're going to need the Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac here, 100%, and the Ring of Royal Grandeur in the cube. That or vice versa. Now, for seasonal, if you are on seasonal, you can run a Convention of Elements in this ring slot. The Convention of Elements, always strong for getting that bonus damage. When that's on fire, you definitely want to make sure and get those Wave of Light shots out to get that bonus damage. And when you are on seasonal, you don't have to worry about the Ring of Royal Grandeur because it is the Season of Grandeur, which is the difference. So this build is still functional on non-seasonal, but it's also even more impactful on seasonal because you can socket something like a Convention of Elements into your gear. And that Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac, for non-seasonal people, you might want it here or the Ring of Royal Grandeur, whichever one is a better roll. And then you can have one of those in the cube and one of them equipped. Now, we didn't mention the belt slot because for the Innas, you definitely need to have the gloves, the chest, the belt, the pants, and the boots. Because the other two items are your weapon and your helm, you can't replace those because you need the dual wielding and you need the Zokrins. And so you need to make sure that you have the boots, pants, belt, chest, and gloves to make this work on seasonal with that Ring of Royal Grandeur and vice versa non-seasonal. These are the 5 pieces that you'll need and it can't change, so you need those in place. So now let's talk about the Kanai's Cube, which we've already touched on multiple times. But for the weapon slot, we already know what's going to go here. The Incense Torch of the Grand Temple reduces the spirit cost of Wave of Light by 50%, but increasing its damage by 550%. And that's where the big power spike is for this build. Mystic Ally summons 2 Mystic Allies that fight by your side. Since you're getting all the allies, that's double the fun. You need the Crudus Boots in here to make Inna's work. Inna's does more damage based on how many allies you have up. The Crudus Boots doubles the allies that you have, meaning it doubles the damage, essentially, in terms of what you're going to be doing. And then again, for the jewelry slot, you want to have the Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac or the Convention of Elements, depending on which you have a better roll on. Traditionally, the Convention of Elements can have better rolls for primary stats that you can equip. In the Obsidian Ring here, it's just a matter of where you're at in your seasonal journey in terms of which one will be more effective in which slot. When it comes to the legendary gems, Bane of the Trapped will always be good. You already have something that's proccing that. You have the slow being procced from your Pento's Pride, as well as some other elements that go on. So getting that bonus damage versus control impaired enemies will always be a good way to get extra damage. Zai's Stone, since this is a ranged build, you can cast this across the screen. Zai's Stone, very strong for this ranged Wave of Light build. We know that's been very impactful. And then Bane of the Stricken. If you are at high Greater Rifts, Bane of the Stricken is very important. When you get to the Greater Rift boss, this build does not excel at single target damage and can actually be quite problematic. You can stand at max range and just cast Wave of Light all day, but you'll see that the single target damage pales in comparison to some other builds that are out there. And so when you are playing this build, whether it's elites or anything like that, you'd like to get them to path with you so you can continue to hit them as well as groups of enemies, which is where the area damage comes in. Single target damage is not where this excels, but Bane of the Stricken does give you that extra damage against Rift bosses, which will help a lot. Plus, every time you make an attack, it's going to increase the damage, which is important. So when you get on those Rift bosses, when you get on those elites, you don't want to necessarily be killing the elites, and there is some of that in this video to show the difference between focusing groups of enemies versus a single target. You'll see a drastic difference in terms of the damage that it could potentially do as a group versus single target, but this will help at those high Greater Rifts. If you're at low Greater Rifts, Bane of the Powerful will always be strong. You kill one of those bosses, you kill an elite, and then you can start rolling through with this build, but at high Greater Rifts, Bane of the Stricken is where it's at. To talk a little about the playstyle, it's key to note the way that the Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac functions. Reduce the remaining cooldown of one of your skills by 1 second when you hit with a resource spending attack. Now, you will be using Wave of Light constantly, and that will give you the damage, and it will proc the Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac. But it's key to note that it's one of your skills by 1 second, meaning that it will do one ability, one skill one time, and then another skill another time. And so with your Wave of Light, you're going to need to just spam this, and then you'll see, because your Serenity doesn't go on cooldown until after it's done. Your Epiphany is one of those things you want to have 100% uptime on, which is why you need some cooldown reduction. Also, your Mystic Ally is very crucial to this build, because when you have the Mystic Ally out, that is your essential spirit generator. Because you get all the runes, you can just use this skill and then get spirit back, because this is the only way you're really going to effectively get this back. Wave of Light goes out, and then so that's going to take up another cooldown slot. So when you look at your spirit bar, you don't necessarily want to pop your Mystic Ally until you need spirit, because it will fill up your spirit bar essentially. And so you don't want to use that on cooldown, because that's taking away the cooldown reduction from your Desert Shroud or your Dashing Strike. And your Dashing Strike gives you dodge chance. So there are 3 defensive abilities, and 4 potentially if you use your mantra, but 3 defensive abilities that all need to try and have as much uptime as possible. So cooldown reduction is important on your gear, but then also your cooldown management. So the Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac, you don't want to just use your Mystic Ally on cooldown. You don't want to spam your Dashing Strike unless absolutely necessary to get out of danger, because you're going to take away from the cooldown reduction of another ability that could potentially keep you alive or give you spirit. So it does require some management and some getting used to with this build. But make no mistake about it, this is one of the easiest builds to run. And you stand at range as a monk, you have an army out in front of you. It's just a very easy way to get damage out at range, feel very strong with this build baseline, and then once you start to pick up the tricks on grouping enemies up, when to use your Dashing Strike, how to get to one side of the room to the other, your defensive cooldowns that are going to be available with your Serenity to make sure you can live in the danger zones before you get the cooldown reduction to get out and then turn and cast your Wave of Light. This has very high potential for a lot of monks, but I can't stress enough how easy it is to just point and click with this build and feel impactful. And hopefully you feel impactful as well in Season 16, because that's going to do it for this Diablo 3 monk build. Let me know what you think in the comments and what builds you're running, and whether you see any variations out there, whether you have any additional tips and tricks you want to leave in the comments. As always, I appreciate you guys watching. Until next time, happy hunting. See you again.